Hello, all of you out there. Thank you for joining us on this beautiful evening to celebrate the publication of Merilyn Simonds' new book, Woman Watching. I think we're in for a treat this evening. Before I go through our full introductions, I have a couple of these classic announcements we need to do. This evening's event is made possible with financial assistance from the Canada Council for the Arts through the Writers' Union of Canada, and we're very grateful for their ongoing support. While this is a Zoom event, Merilyn and Helen will come to you from Kingston, where they work on land that's the traditional territory of the Huron-Wendat, the Anishinaabeg, and the Haudenosaunee peoples. I'm Susan Renouf. I am luckily the editor and publisher for both Helen and Merilyn, and it's really a treat to see them at the same event. It's my pleasure to introduce these two amazing women, whom I first met professionally years ago when I edited and published my first books working with them. My respect and affection for them has grown year over year since. Helen and Merilyn write very different books, but they share a fierce passion for the natural world and an incredible ability to pour that passion onto the page, a talent that inevitably changes the hearts and the minds of their readers. Helen Humphreys is the award-winning author of books of fiction, nonfiction, and poetry, including ECW's own field study and her most recent from HarperCollins, And a Dog Called Fig. Merilyn Simonds is the author of 18 books, including the one we are celebrating tonight, Woman Watching, Louise de Kiriline Lawrence, and the Songbirds of Pimisi Bay. She's a champion of Canadian writers and writing through her tenure as the co-founder and artistic director of the Kingston Writers Fest. She's a stunning writer, a lifelong birder, and a student of women's issues and history. All of these talents have poured into this gorgeously written and riveting portrait of the amazing Louise. We're so lucky to have them in conversation this evening, and I now turn it over to them.
Hello.
Hello.
This feels really strange, right? We were supposed to be in the same room, surrounded by plants, and yeah, but as it happens, we're because of COVID and an exposure I had, we're in our own houses, which aren't that far apart. We could probably lean out the window and call to each other.
Yeah, we might be able to do that. So
yeah.
Here we are, and I'm thinking because it's the publication of your book, you should go first and talk about why you wrote this book.
Yeah, you know, that's not an easy question. I don't know what you find with your books, but my books don't always have a really clear genesis, right? They're a bit of a walk in the woods. They have to have times to simmer, to have a mixed metaphor. I wrote a magazine profile of Louise back in 1989, and at that time she asked me to be her biographer, and I sort of off the top said, oh sure, but really I couldn't imagine how to do it. I couldn't imagine writing a straightforward biography. I don't really read them, and I didn't think I could write one. And it, you know, an idea has to really grab me if I'm going to spend the months and years it takes to write it. So it wasn't really until a few years ago when I started living half the year in Mexico, which is the wintering grounds for, we live up in the mountains in the center of the country, and it's the wintering grounds for some of the birds that reproduce here in the summer. And I became intrigued by the idea that what we call our birds here in Canada, they actually only live here for a couple of months, you know, 2 to 3 months while they raise their families. And they live most of their lives in the south, where the Mexicans also call them our birds, nuestras aves. And Louise was like that. She was Swedish, born into Swedish aristocracy. Her godmother was the Queen of Denmark. Her first husband was a white Russian that she followed into the Russian Civil War. She ended up in a Bolshevik prison, but she was one of us too. She was more Canadian than a lot of us who are raised under the maple leaf. So in some ways, I came to her story partly through birds but also I think more fundamentally through the notion of migration that really kind of intrigued me about her and about the birds that were kind of the focus of the part of her, the sort of the latter 50 years of her life. She lived almost 100 years. And where did field study begin?
Yeah, well, like you, it's kind of an evolution, right? I mean, I guess that's because usually there's a spark, isn't there, for something, and then it sort of evolves over a long period of time. But field study came about because I always have dogs, and I have to do this long morning walk with them that's like 2 hours, and I'm in nature, and I'd be thinking a lot about nature in terms of how important it had become to me, but then also about what was happening to nature because of climate crisis and the extinctions and biodiversity threats and all of that. And so I was thinking about how could I reconcile those two things? One, where nature is increasingly important, and two, where nature is just completely really under threat and increasing threat. So I was trying to figure out how I could write about those two things somehow. And I thought, well, it would be interesting to look at the way humans and nature have interacted through time. And I sort of stumbled upon the idea of the herbarium, which is basically a dried plant library. And I thought, and it has collectors who collected various plants, and they put notations on the specimens. And so you were able to actually kind of witness the moment when a plant was collected and what a person thought about it through time. So I decided that it would be, I'd find something out by studying how that was for different people, 100, 200 years ago, and what would I find out? I had no idea, but I thought it'd be an interesting place to start. So I basically went to the herbarium that's close to Kingston, which is run through Queen's University, and they had 144,000 specimens, and I just decided to look through all of them. That was my only criteria for starting.
I remember we went for a walk when you were kind of about halfway through and thinking, what? What have I signed on for?
Yeah, there's a part where they're endless.
Yeah, it's really interesting to me because I kind of saw I kind of saw that collecting mentality from the opposite end. Louise often collected birds. She never shot a bird, but she would collect them from the roadsides and anything she found in the woods, birds, nests, that sort of thing. And she donated them to the ROM and to the National Museum of Natural History, which is now the Canadian Museum of Nature. So if you go to those places, you can see her specimens. And the first time I went to the ROM, their collection wasn't digitized, but they have, I can't remember now, but it is a huge number of bird skins, they call them. And, drawer after drawer after drawer. And I found it kind of claustrophobic, kind of, well, it was really moving and a bit depressing to be surrounded by all that death, like rows and rows and rows of dead birds. And I understand the reason for wanting that in order to, there's a rationale for having a longitudinal group of skins to sort of compare how the bird has changed according to climate or food stocks or whatever. And some birds that are extinct, like the passenger pigeon, the ROM has specimens of the passenger pigeon, and other birds that are, I think they have an auk as well, a great auk. So they have, birds that have become extinct. So there's a value in that. But there's also this overwhelming sense of these flocks of stilled birds.
Yeah. I think that would be more powerful with birds, I think, because with the plants, even though I also had that same thing happen to me where it felt like a mausoleum, of all these plants layered on top of one another. And it was also climate controlled. So it was very cold in there. I don't know if the ROM is cold. So it also made it feel mausoleum-like. But with the plants, what was interesting was that there was a lot of life in the death. Like, a pussy willow, 100 years old, will still be soft. and a pine,
Wow.
150 years old, a dead piece of pine will still smell like a pine. So I was surprised in my discovery, like how much there was a kind of overlap between life and death. And I ended up writing a bit about that because it was interesting to me. But I could see with birds, because we're so used to birds flying.
Because they're animate, right?
Yeah,
And they move and they flicker and they sing, and you know, they're never still in the way even that humans are. They're rarely still. So I think that was part of it, but I also think it was the environment, which is bunker-like. You know, these floor-to-ceiling drawers, you know, with all these hundreds of thousands of birds in them, and it feels like a bank vault in a way. Like there's something very cold and impersonal about it. And because the collection wasn't fully digitized then, now you can just like you can go online, all the natural history museums, many of them, not all of them, but many of them in the whole world are digitized, and you can go and you can find out, you know, what birds are where, and put in Louise's name, and you can see where, you know, where the birds she collected are living. But at the time, one of the curators would have to find her specimens, and they could only find 3 for me. And so I handled them, and there was something very moving about handling a bird that had been living. These were all collected in the early 50s, late 40s. So what's that, 70 years ago?
And what kind of birds were they?
Red crossbill, white crossbill. I think there was a warbler, a black-throated blue, I believe, warbler, and grosbeaks, evening grosbeaks, and nests. And actually the nests were more phenomenal to me, maybe because like plants, they were inanimate to begin with, right? But the nest was amazing. There were 2 nests at the ROM, and the feathers that lined the nest were still soft, and the bark, you know, the feathers are the most immediate part of the ball that touches the eggs, and one of the nests had a broken egg in it. So that was pretty amazing. But then there's birch bark, and there's pieces of wasp nest, and pieces of cedar bark, and then it gets rougher and rougher as you go out, you know, twigs, and then I think it was a spruce that the nest was cut away from. But it looked like a nest that you or I might find in the woods, you know, tonight.
Yeah.
So
it held up so well.
Yeah, and it had the same thing that I think you found with the plants. It had just an identifier, you know, Louise de Kiriline Lawrence, red crossbill, the Latin name, collected, the date, and the place. You know.
And was there did she put any other information on that label?
No, and she didn't write the label.
Oh, interesting.
It was written by the curator at actually, what's he called? The preparateur. So the person who prepared the skin, which is quite an involved process. But he had his initials on that. And one of the really interesting things for me, and I'm sure you must have found the same thing, like these little threads that you can follow back into the past, right? So the initials of the preparateur were the same as the initials of the man who taught her how to prepare bird skins. And she talks about him. His last name was Hope, which I thought was interesting.
Oh, that is interesting. Because on the labels, which is like sort of a business card size thing, at the bottom of the plant specimens on the collector can put anything basically on that label. I mean, they do put things like where they collected it, the name, the Latin name, the date, but they also put other things. And depending on, there was a lot of amateur plant collectors, just like they were, right? So the amateurs
was too for birds, right?
Yeah, so they could actually just put anything there, and some of them you know, they would write little notes, or they'd just say something about something else, or it would, so I found those really kind of interesting. They were tiny stories in précis, really,
Wow.
that was on the bottom there.
Well, I think with the birds, by the time Louise came along, it was already fairly formalized.
Mhm.
And so they were encouraged not to prepare the skins themselves because they were so easily damaged. And in fact, Louise tried to prepare some skins and sort of gave up, even though she considered herself a fairly precise human being. It's really a trick to make it end up looking like a bird when it's only a skin with no muscle or bone or anything inside.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, that was just part of the research for me with this book. I mean, we were talking before we came on about the challenges of these various books. And for this book, it's that it's not that I didn't have enough resources. I had way too much. There were 26 bankers boxes at Library and Archives Canada filled with letters, manuscripts, research data clippings, and dozens more boxes at the Preservation Center filled with photographs and drawings, plus when I went looking, files at the Smithsonian, at the Museum of Nature, at the University of Northern British Columbia, at Cornell, at the Thomas Fisher Rare Books Library, and thousands of letters she wrote to her mother every Sunday from 1918, when she married Gleb Nikolaevich, her first husband, the White Russian, and left home until 1958, when her mother died and Louise got all her letters back. Thank goodness for me, because they were filled with, you know, the minutiae of her daily life, you know, like baking a lemon pie with war ration sugar, you know, how long she had to save up in order to bake one pie. But she and her mother were really close. So she, you know, she charts her emotional life, her physical well-being, her worries about her career. I mean, I was close to my mother too, but I never talked to her about writing. But Louise talked about everything with her mother, unfortunately in 5 languages. So French, Russian, Swedish, Danish, and English.
Wow.
So I did have to get translators lined up for, I didn't translate all the letters, but quite a few of them. And
So
then there were, sorry.
So if you had that much material, how did you decide what to take? Like, what was your path through?
Well, it was really difficult to know. So I read the letters to her mother first, because I figured that would kind of give me a quotidian timeline, you know, landmarks in her life. And then she wrote to dozens of scientists, long correspondences, like 200 letters to Earl Godfrey, who wrote the Second Birds of Canada. You know, Alexander Scutch in Costa Rica, and Roy Ivor in Mississauga. And I mean, people all, Margaret Morse Nice in Oklahoma, and later in Illinois. So I haven't really thought of this before, but I think I went to the personal first, and then to the professional, because I wanted to have a sense of who she was. I mean, I knew her. I met her. She lived not far from me when I was living just south of North Bay. She was living not too far from Bonfield, near Rutherglen, places that may not mean much to those of you who are tuning in from Hawaii and Mexico, but they're little towns in Northern Ontario. But yeah, I think before I met her as an amateur self-trained ornithologist, I wanted to know who she was as a person, so that I could understand whether this obsession with birds was unique, or whether it was part of her, and showed up in different ways through her life, which in fact I think was the case. And we're just lucky that she channeled it to birds for 50 years.
Right. Interesting.
So did you, how easy was it for you to find the stories of some of the collectors of the plant material in the herbarium?
Yeah, it wasn't that easy. Because when I started looking through the specimens, I had this idea that I was going to look through all 144,000, but that was the only thing I had thought. I thought I'm just going to let the book sort of take its own shape depending on what I find. And then I started to, when I started researching trying to figure out the collectors, I thought, well, again, like you, I would go through the personal, and that would be a really interesting place to go. But I would have to look, a lot of especially with the amateurs, they'd left no trail. And especially also with the women, it was very hard to trace them, because a lot of them would put they'd be Mrs. So-and-so. And then you had no idea, or even worse, Miss So-and-so. And you had no idea who they were in the 18, they just left no trail whatsoever. So I went to obituaries, I looked for articles, I looked everywhere I could, and I managed probably to get half of them, stories for probably half of them, which I think was lucky.
That's amazing. Yeah.
Yeah. But and I really liked just, finding that they were all interesting, all the ones I found, but I wish I could have, found the other ones, but it was just impossible. The historical record didn't,
Well,
remember them.
the women have disappeared. It's the same in ornithology. They all went by their husbands' names. And so, wisely or not, I have a chapter that sort of looks at the lineage of women that Louise stepped into when she started looking at birds, because she'd be the first to tell you she wasn't the first eccentric woman to go tramping around in the woods after birds. But it was the ones who published are the ones you know about.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, there was an amazing birder in Alberta named Elsie Castles, and she was quite astonishing. She was the first to write the life histories of the gyrfalcon and another bird, which I can't remember right now. And she, for 50 years, she made notes on all the bird life around red deer. And I believe there's a sanctuary up there now named after her. But when she died, her husband destroyed all of her notes and records. So gone, I mean, it's well, we've both written historical things before, and it's such an accident what is preserved and what,
Yeah, that's right.
what carries on, right?
Yeah. And in the plant world, there was a woman called Mary Treat, who lived in the eastern the United States, I think Maine. But her husband left her when she was 44, and she had to make a living. And so she started sort of botanizing around her house, and just sort of kept track of all the plants that were directly around her house. And she ended up writing these books that were quite popular at the time, but she was doing it so she could make money to live and continue to care for her children. So that sometimes the women, you could find them because of something like that, where circumstance has dictated that they become more public than they might otherwise have been.
And I think too, if they had a penchant for writing, right? So it's the same thing. I mean, one of the first nature writers, female nature writers in the States, a woman who's called the mother of American nature writing, is Susan Fenimore Cooper, who is James Fenimore Cooper's daughter. And usually in Wikipedia stuff, she's called his amanuensis. She's the one who transcribed all of his novels, etc. But actually, she wrote in 1850 a book called Rural Hours, which is quite an amazing book of nature writing, largely concentrating on birds. And she was, she had that sort of scientific curiosity. She saw, what bird would it have been? I think it's been some kind of a tern. Anyway, she saw it diving for fish. And so she managed to catch one of the birds and attach a fishing line to it. And so she could measure exactly how far down it dove, right? So it's that resourcefulness and curiosity that you find again and again, certainly in the bird world. And the very first bird guide was written by a woman. Florence Miriam Bailey wrote it when she was 26, called Birds Through an Opera Glass. And I mean, it reads as quite a peculiarity now, but it was the first. And I think women, I wonder if this was,
the first wildflower guide was also written by a woman, William
isn't that
Stardana.
interesting?
Yeah, I think it was called How to Know the Wildflowers.
And do you think there was any difference in how the women plant collectors were viewing the plant world compared to the male plant collectors?
Not much, no. I think it was pretty even. And I think they were treated also fairly similarly. Like they were treated, you know, the ones who were experts were treated as experts. They're still in, I think it's Mary Agnes Chase, who was a suffragette in the States. And she decided to concentrate on grasses because they were near the roadside. They were easy for her to study.
Right.
She, you know, so she wrote a book, Manual of Grasses, and it's still the manual of grasses that they use in America. It's still the authority. And she was an amateur, but it's really interesting. And the grasses of Canada, we have one as well, but it's based on her thing as well. So it's yeah.
Well, yeah, I think their contributions were really lasting. For Louise, if you go on the Cornell site, All About Birds, they still reference her work on woodpeckers on that site, because that's the seminal work on woodpeckers. I also looked for sexism. I looked really hard for sexism in her letters, right? Because there were so many personal letters from mostly male ornithologists, and the scientists were almost all men. And, you know, I really couldn't find it. They wrote to her with great respect. They supported her work. They made her feel as valuable as any work that they were doing. There's only one exception, and this was a Finnish ornithologist. And I think he thought this was in a letter to a mutual friend, and I think he thought he was giving her a compliment, but it's certainly a backhanded compliment. He wrote that Louise has the same very careful and thorough way to work as dear Margaret Nice, who was sort of the main female ornithologist at the time. Women ornithologists, he said, do rarely have so much patience. They draw their conclusions quicker and with less material, and often with poorer results. So, you know, there was that sort of underlying sexism. And, you know, Louise wasn't shy at all about taking on that kind of an attitude. With Margaret Nice, she waged this campaign against lazy science, she called it, and exposing one particularly arrogant male scientist who ignored the close observations of herself and other women watchers, and instead used reproductive data and egg size and egg number data that had been brought down from Aristotle, of all things, you know, and they were still using this thousands of year old data rather than relying on the observations of women. So I think maybe there wasn't, you know, on an individual level, wasn't a lot of, I think there was real appreciation, but the culture itself, you know, in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s was still, it was still a fairly sexist culture.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I was going to read something, and I had a really good idea for how to get into the reading, and now I don't remember what it was, but luckily for me, I wrote it down. Oh, I know, we were talking about challenges, right?
Yeah.
And one of the challenges for me was how to write a biography. I wanted the book to be in her words. I think the reason I'm not super keen on most biographies is that there's this kind of a omniscient narrator. And I didn't want her words to be filtered through me. And luckily, she left all these narrative accounts of her studies. So, you know, I was able to recreate those and get her voice in. And because I knew her, and actually I interviewed her, I had recordings of her voice too, so I could, you know, catch her voice quite easily. But I also wanted the bones of the biography to show. You know, I wanted to take the reader into the ROM vaults. I wanted to talk about the ethical dilemmas that I was feeling, you know, writing the life story of someone I knew only for a few years at the end of her life. I mean, I didn't know her as a child. I didn't know her as a young woman. And that's, you know, that's quite a leap. It's an imaginative leap, and you may get it wrong. I may get it wrong. So the book, as it evolved, became sort of part memoir, a memoir in some ways of my own life with birds, but also a memoir of writing the book. But I didn't want my voice to be too loud either. So the big challenge for me was to try to balance those competing desires, let Louise tell her own story, pausing now and then to tell the story of how my life was intersecting with hers. And this is the segue, because I remember a walk that we took at Lemoyne Point, and I was, talking to you about this dilemma before I'd actually started writing, and you were encouraging me to include my own experience. And so the part I'm going to read is from the very beginning of the book. And when I told you this story, you said, "That's your opening." And I said, "Oh, okay." And it was, and it still is. So it's short. If all of you out there, which as far as we're concerned, it's just the two of us, right? So if you will indulge me, the opening is called The Golden Bird. And we should show people what our books look like, actually. I'm so dyslexic, honestly, on the, okay, that's the book. It's the most beautiful cover. ECW made beautiful, beautiful books for us.
I did show the back as well. I think the back.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, the birds. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Isn't that beautiful? Yeah.
Right.
And on the inside, it has pictures and there's a drawing on every page. And let's talk about drawing after.
Yeah.
So The Golden Bird. The March sun wasn't yet warm enough to slump the snow when the evening grosbeaks descended on Louise's feeding station. She was watching out her kitchen window, as she always did, a cup of strong coffee in hand, her reward after a vigorous bird walk at dawn, a habit of 40 years she'd not yet given up, even on the cusp of 90. The flock of black and yellow birds mobbing her tray of sunflower seeds was the largest she'd seen in years. For decades, she'd been collecting data on evening grosbeaks. How many came to her feeder, male or female, when and where they nested, how long the eggs took to hatch and the young to fledge. She made a mental note to check her records to see if the numbers this spring were indeed record-breaking. Suddenly, amidst the throng, a flash of pure gold. Louise lifted her binoculars. Obviously a grosbeak, those thick seed-cracking bills, but solidly yellow, like an oversized canary. The other birds settled back to their feeding, edging the uncanny bird off the tray whenever it tried to snatch a seed, until finally the gilded bird rose like a wisp of pure sunshine and disappeared among the trees. My feeder was half an hour southwest of Louise's, flying as a hungry bird might along the canopy highway of boreal forest between her log house nestled in the pines on the edge of Pimisi Bay and my R2000 prefab tucked into hundreds of acres of forest just south of Callander in Ontario's near north. Evening grosbeak shifted across my wooden feeding tray as if by some prearranged schedule, clearly not women and children first, as it was the males that were snuffling up the sunflower seeds, cracking them open and scooping out the meat with their thick curling tongues, blackening the snow with shells. The motorcycle gang, I called these birds, gold slashes above the eyes like cool yellow sunglasses, wings glossy as black leather jackets with startling white blaze. My sons were at school, my husband at work. I stood alone at the sliding glass doors counting 100 birds at least. Silvery females were jostling for seed now. Suddenly they fluttered up, a small explosion, leaving a strange golden bird alone on the tray. The golden bird is one of the tales collected by the Grimm brothers. In the fable, when a king discovers that golden apples are missing from his orchard, he asks his 3 sons to watch for the thief. Only the youngest stays awake to identify the culprit, a golden bird. The story is found in other collections too, although the bird often changes species, a golden blackbird in one, and in the French-Canadian version, a golden phoenix. Nowhere is the golden bird a grosbeak, except in Louise's yard and mine. I met Louise de Kiriline Lawrence in 1980, just a few years before the golden bird landed on both our feeding trays. She was an imposing woman, tall, square-jawed, and high-cheeked in that Scandinavian way, her hair clipped sensibly short, though still elegant. A handsome, no-nonsense woman with penetrating eyes. I was barely 30, living in the bush with my artist husband and 2 young boys scarcely in school. I had just written my first book. Louise had just published her last, although neither of us knew it then. I had brought my copy of To Whom the Wilderness Speaks to her book signing at the library in North Bay. I arrived late, hoping the crowd would have thinned, but the room was still jammed with people pressing to be close to Louise. I held out the book and she briskly asked my name as she'd asked almost 100 others before me. Then she signed her own name with a flourish and flashing me a smile said, "Tack så mycket," as I melted silently into the crowd. We met occasionally after that. The few times we were together, we talked birds and writing and how the Northwoods inspired us and at the same time threw up its obstacles. I moved and she died 30 years ago, as a matter of fact, as of April 27th this year. But the idea of this woman alone in the woods watching stayed with me. What drove her particular brand of curiosity? What fueled her passion for birds? A devotion that never faltered for half a century. What in her background or her character or her situation conspired to shape this immigrant woman isolated in a log cabin in the Northern Ontario bush into one of Canada's first and finest amateur ornithologists and nature writers? I ponder this as I watch a gang of violet-crowned and broad-billed hummingbirds frantically licking up the nectar from the feeders outside my windows in the mountains of Central Mexico. Idly, I wonder what feeding schedule these birds are on. How much do they drink at each visit to the feeder? How often do they pause to check for interlopers and threats? If I were Louise, I would get out my stopwatch and my notebook to record the timing and length of each visit. I'd set up a live trap and band the flitting birds to determine if one particular violet-crowned visited many times or if a shimmer of hummingbirds was feeding outside my window. But I'm not Louise. I lack the patience for scientific study. Besides, it is Louise, not hummingbirds, I have in my sights. She's gone, but still I watch her. Through her vast correspondence, her speeches, her books and articles, her drawings and photographs, the birds and nests she salvaged for museums, the neatly typed records sequestered in archives across the continent. A life history is what I'm after, not of a species, but of a watcher named Louise.
That's great. Thank you.
So you were, you certainly pressed me to include that evening grosbeak story. And then as I started to write it, I thought, oh my goodness, am I making this up? Did that really happen? But she actually noted when she saw that bird. So then I had to get out my diaries, which I've been keeping since I was 7 years old. And I found the reference to that bird. And it was 2 or 3 days apart when we each saw the same bird. So that was pretty cool.
Yeah, very magical.
Yeah. So what were the happy surprises that you found when you were working on that book?
I think what I said before about the fact that a lot of the plant life resembled itself in death, it resembled its living self in death, and that it was less dead. It felt less dead in a way. So that was a pretty happy surprise. Some of the stories of the collectors and how interesting I found them as people was a happy surprise also. And I think, I had gone in, I had some ideas about which flowers I was going to like, in death, similar to the ones I liked in life. And I had this, I thought the showy flowers were going to be just as beautiful in death as they were in life. But when you press something, you press often the sort of essence right out of it. And so a lot of the showy flowers just dried to a kind of mush.
Especially the shape, right? You lose that three-dimensionality, right?
Yeah, they were quite indistinct, and they just become this kind of pulpy, mess. But those very simple shapes, the grasses in particular, which at one point I despaired of the grasses because they are the largest category in the herbarium, and I spent weeks in the grasslands, like just going through folder after folder of grasses. But the grasses were, sometimes they were placed on the page as though they were bending in the wind. They were exactly the same in death as they were in life. Like every little fiber, every little hair, every little piece of root was still there, and they dried so beautifully and so perfectly. So I guess I came to appreciate different plants just because of how they were in death, as opposed to how they were in life. And that was interesting. That was a happy surprise for me.
Well, that story reminds me of a book, and I think I lent this to you along the way. I think it's called The Shadow Book. And it was a photographer who had found one of the old botanical, what do they call them, sort of botanical scrapbooks that sort of well-bred young women of the late 19th century would collect plants and tape them into these plant scrapbooks. And this photographer had found this at a flea market or something. And the book hadn't been open in ages. And so the plants had created a shadow impression on the opposite page, which was so astonishing to me. I don't know why that moved me so much, but plants are so ephemeral, much, to my mind anyway, much more ephemeral than birds, which live many, many years. Instead of a life cycle of a season. And so for a plant to have that kind of longevity, its shape, and as you said, its fragrance lasting, seems more of a miracle to me, because the bodies of the birds were pretty much a disappointment to me, I would say. Not to a real researcher. There was somebody else in the vaults when I was there, stretching out the wing and measuring it, and, finding things of interest in those birds. But the plants, seem to have a life after death that the birds don't, which kind of leads me into drawing. Some of your drawings are in the book.
Yeah, that's right.
And
find one.
and show the cover of the book, because it's so beautiful.
Yes, cover. This is the cover.
Gorgeous.
And then it's got tons of illustrated material, most like specimens from the herbarium.
Yeah.
And then some of my own drawings as well. Because I began a drawing practice around the time that I was working on the book. That's Chicory, that's one of mine.
Beautiful.
So they all kind of went together.
And I started drawing too when I was working on this, because Louise drew, because she came from a wealthy family. She would have been drawing as a child and a young woman. But when she started to write about birds, she started to draw them for quite practical reasons, because she had very little money, and the scientific work she did earned nothing. And so she was writing popular articles from the same material. And she started illustrating them as sort of a second income stream to help support her, which we can all understand. But it also, I think, was partly to train her eye, which is why I started to do it. She has pages of wings and beaks and chickadees in various poses, but she started on her dogs. She started by drawing her dogs and her own left hand with a cigarette in it, which is the only way I knew that she smoked.
That's good.
But so did you start drawing with this book, or had you already started before that?
I might have started just before this book, but it's pretty much coincided with this book, I think. And I would just, I started drawing things I brought home in the morning from the dog walk, just bits of nature that I found. I did sticks for a long time. I think you've seen some of my twigs.
Yes.
And then I moved on to other things. Yeah, and then I took some courses, and during the pandemic, actually, I took a 6-month certificate program through the Royal Botanic Gardens in Edinburgh, which was very hard. They were very hard markers, I have to say. I tried so hard, and I got probably a C at the end of it, but it was good to do. So yeah, so it's ongoing, my practice, it's ongoing, and I keep learning and trying new things.
Well, and at least the plants sit still.
Yeah,
right?
they sit
I mean,
still.
the birds are moving all the time. So basically, what I find is I'm learning to do gesture drawing.
Yes, but
because
the plants decompose very quickly, though. So
okay.
right, they wilt and
I know
they, so there's all of that. So yeah, I think they both have their limitations, maybe.
Yeah, actually, so that would be really interesting because, and where have I seen this? You could do a series of drawings of the same plant as it moves through that evolution, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you could. You'd have to catch it. You'd have to be quite quick, though. And the problem
Per
is,
hour.
yeah, sometimes it takes a long time. But I keep things in the fridge. That prolongs things a little bit, and
Oh,
you
really?
can take photos with your phone, and so you can get some of the details from that. So
yeah. And I'm just gonna have a little commercial break here that if anybody wants to buy a Helen Humphreys drawing of a tulip, it is available at the online auction for the Peely Island Bird Observatory, pibo.ca. And you'll have to fight me for it. So
I think maybe I'll do a little reading now.
I think you should.
Yeah.
And after that, if people have questions, you should be putting them into the chat stream now because somebody is monitoring that, and they'll
I think the Q&A box rather than the
chat.
the
Q&A box? Okay.
Yeah, they're separate.
Okay, all right.
Things.
And are you going to read from Field Study or from your book?
Yeah, I'm going to read from Field Study. I'm just going to read a tiny bit. It just that takes place in Kingston. And just a little bit about one of the collectors. So one of the collectors who I really got quite fond of was a woman called Annie Boyd, and she collected in the late 1800s. She lived in Kingston, and she collected specimens that she could reach around Kingston by bicycle, which was her mode of transport. So she would bicycle as far as she could bicycle is as far as she would collect. She got a master's degree at Queen's at the time, where the science program had only just recently opened its classes to women students. So
wow,
she was one of the very first. And then she ended up teaching high school as a job as a science teacher at Morrisburg Collegiate. But I'm just going to read this part where she gets the specimen of white pine on July 7th, 1897 at Cartwright Point, which is, it's a neighborhood on the St. Lawrence River in Kingston that we're both familiar with, just east of Kingston. Because Cartwright Point is close to where I live, I drive out to look at the white pines. It is not the summer day that Annie Boyd had when she bicycled across the causeway and up Berryfield Hill on her way to the point, but is instead a cold April morning with a brisk wind and scraps of cloud moving fast across the pale blue sky. Winter has just retreated from the landscape, and the deciduous trees have yet to leaf, so it's easy to spot Annie's white pines, as they are the only green in the canopy, and they tower 20 or 30 feet above the other trees. The point has houses and cottages peppered along its spine, but they are inserted into the woods that cover the land, not carved out of it. So the tree cover has probably remained fairly consistent from Annie Boyd's time to mine. I drive the short length of the point and back again, past the mossy slabs of limestone that rise out of last year's dead leaves. The trunks of the pines are too big to encircle with my arms when I get out to try. It is easier to see the scope of the pines from the road that runs across the top of Cartwright Point because it is on a rise and the land falls away below it. The white pines run in a feathery stutter through the whole point, their massive green tops often touching and all slanting about 15 degrees to the east because the prevailing wind off Lake Ontario is westerly. When Annie Boyd bicycled out here in 1897, she was probably collecting more specimens than just the white pine. She might have come for most of a day, leaning her bicycle up against one tree and then another, creeping through the woods in search of flowers and ferns. The white pine didn't have to be looked for. It was simply there in abundance, sighing above her head as she walked through the woods. The wind in the branches of the trees sounding exactly like her breath or mine. I'll stop there.
That's beautiful. Louise drew a particular white pine that she called the old pine, and that was a character in her first book, The Log House Nest. She drew it over and over and over again. She has sketchbooks filled with this white pine. I think because the branches do that, right? They really flow with the wind. So I can just envision what you were writing about there.
Yeah, and what I was trying to do often with the collectors was to find a point of connection. So if they were collecting somewhere where I could get to, I would go there and look for the evidence of the trees or the plants, and yeah, it was that was.
I love
nice
the section where you found the red oak specimen. I think it was a red oak specimen, right? That had come from the cemetery where your brother is buried, and going there and looking for that tree was just it was a lovely piece of writing.
Yeah, so thank you.
Yeah,
it was nice. I mean, I think with my book, what really happened with me is there was this sort of merging between the living and the dead, and the past and the present. It really sort of blended all together, and that was the kind of the magic of it, I guess, for me, was the way death just sort of moved into life, and vice versa, all the way through the
well,
plants.
and that's one of the, not the lessons of nature, that sounds so trite, but it's kind of what I go to nature for, is that longer view, that that wider context. One of the things that is really striking me now, since the bird report came out recently, that we've lost 3 billion birds in North America in the last 50 years. Well, that's counting since 1970. Well, Louise tracked bird population decline in her forest from the mid 40s to the late 50s, and wrote about that. And two of the warblers, the chestnut-sided and the mourning warbler, well, all the warblers she tracked, there were 13 warblers, they all went down by at least 10%, some of them more. But those two, the chestnut-sided and the mourning warbler, went down by 75%.
Wow.
In those years, right? So somebody says, okay, birds are down by 40%. Well, in the last 50 years, but that's 40% on top of the losses, since the turn of the last century, and on top of the losses since Thoreau, right? And if you take the kind of bird world that he saw, the rich orchestra that he heard as the dawn chorus, and the little, bird by bird, little chamber orchestra that we hear now, it's that helps me put the biodiversity crisis, our environmental crisis, in an even more startling context. Yeah.
Should we do questions?
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say.
Yeah.
So
hello, I'm coming from the ether. I'm just going to be reading out the questions to make things easier. Thank you both so much for that lovely discussion. The first question is from David Kinsman. Hello, Merilyn. Coming from the idea of a collection providing insight into the personality of the collector, how did Louise's relationship to birds change over the course of her life? And did that give you insights into your own relationship with birds over time? Any aspects that surprised you in Louise's journey or your own?
Wow, that's a complex question. Hi, David. Haven't seen you in face to face for a long time, so it's nice to hear from you. So Louise started out, I think, quite sentimental about the birds around her. The very first bird she saw was a Baltimore Oriole, and she called it a jelly belly because it looked like it had been nesting in marmalade. And it wasn't until she found the Taverner book that Birds of Canada that she realized its name and learned its scientific name, etc. So she kind of had that whimsical Scandinavian folktale kind of relationship with birds at the beginning. And it was Taverner who, when she wrote him letters and said, oh, I saw this cardinal in the woods, this red bird, she didn't name it, and wrote about it quite fancifully. He wrote back and saying, okay, now can you describe it so that anybody walking in the woods and seeing that bird would know what they'd seen? So she would then write back with a more careful observation, a more detailed observation. And I think that over the course of those 50 years, her appreciation for it, but really her understanding of individual species just deepened and deepened. It's like a friendship. You see someone crossing your path and, oh, they look interesting. And the more you know them, the more complex they become. And she learned things about birds that had never been observed before, like that red-eyed vireos, which we should be hearing very soon. Red-eyed vireos, when they stake out their territory, within that territory, there are two separate areas, a song area and a nesting area. Female goes to the nesting area, the male goes to the song area, and that's the persistent singing that we hear from the red-eyed vireo. And he doesn't leave his song area, and he keeps singing the same phrases over and over. She did a dawn to dusk count of the red-eyed vireo, and it sang 22,197 songs, dawn to dusk. Who else would count that but Louise de Kiriline Lawrence? But she found out that when he stopped, it wasn't because he was exhausted. He would stop, give a certain call, the female would perk up off her nest, and she would fly to the male, and he would feed her. And it was the first time anybody had observed courtship feeding. And she also found that the chestnut-sided warbler, whenever the female left the nest, when she was brooding the eggs, she always left by the east, and she always returned from the east. And, that kind of detail just got more and more intense as her life went on. And I think that with the drawing that I started to do, very bad drawing, mine will never be seen in public. But it made me, it is making me see birds as individuals. Oh, there's the song sparrow with the funny feather sticking up out of its wing, right? They are individuals. They're not just a bunch of robins or a bunch of cardinals. So that's been what it's been for me, and I think for her.
Okay. Next, Larry Scanlon asks, first he says, wonderful discussion. Thank you both. Your books owe so much to archives, and I'm wondering how secure these archives are. Cost cutting is such an ongoing threat to the arts. Are the archives you both relied on in any danger?
I think I'll go with this one. Yes, my archives are in danger. The herbaria are being digitized, as Merilyn was saying about other natural history collections. And Queen's Herbarium is being digitized, but it's not fully digitized yet. And it was open. They had funding to have somebody working there, but since COVID, it hasn't really been open in the same way it was. So it's still accessible, But herbaria all across the world, I think, are kind of under threat because they're expensive to keep. They need climate control. They need special cabinets. They need, you know, somebody working in there to help the public or people who come in to use the collection. And with the digitization, there's some kind of push for just having digitized versions and not the physical version anymore of the collection, which of course gets rid of all the things that I found when I went there, which is the smell, the texture, all the things that you find by actually going to the physical specimen. So it's this, I think there's this, we're in this moment right now with herbaria where there's sort of the larger herbariums are fine, like the one at the ROM and the National Herbarium, and the one in Ottawa, but some of the smaller ones are, I think, in danger, and there could just be not funding for them one year and they could close. And the argument would be that the collection is being digitized, so you don't need the physical specimens anymore. But the physical specimens are always, there's always something, you know, there's just, plus they're being used to extract DNA from too. So actually maybe, you know, a lot of them won't go, but they're often under threat now anyway, because they're costly to keep.
Well, and I think Library and Archives Canada, which, I mean, all these archives were closed while I was doing the research for this book. And I owe such a debt of gratitude to the archivists. They were just amazing because they still had access to some of the materials and got copies to me, not the actual letters, which I did see just before they all closed. But I think that the old material that they have will stay there to some extent, especially, I mean, in part, that's why I write a book like this, right? Because then it shows the value of these things, and then it makes it less likely or less certain that her archive will be ditched when there's no more room. But I do wonder about collecting contemporary archives, how much of that is possible just because of the glut of paper, which means then it gets collected digitally, which is difficult. Yeah.
Okay, next question. Helen, did any of the collectors know each other? And if so, did they form associations or groups of women amateur botanists?
Yeah, a lot of them knew one another, because a lot of the amateur collectors collected for some of the big, more professional collectors like Asa Gray, who wrote one of the first manuals of plants in North America. So people did know one another, and they often wrote to one another because, of course, they had to identify. Sometimes, if they were unsure of a plant, the way to get the plant identified was to send it to another collector and to get them to tell you what it was. And so there was a lot of interplay between everybody and between amateurs and professionals. And with the women, I didn't find in the vascular plants, I couldn't really find if the women knew one another in a way, you know, in any kind of way where they had formed any kind of association or anything. But in seaweed and algae, which was largely in the Fowler Herbarium anyway, collected by women, and those women all knew one another, and they were sending the seaweed and the algae to one another for identification purposes, and it seemed they had a lot of interaction with one another. So that was also really interesting. And one of the big seaweed collectors who published the first manual of seaweed collecting and illustrated it with her own amazing drawings was a British woman called Margaret Gatty. And she was, because there was a Victorian, at one point there was a Victorian fad for collecting seaweed, like there was for ferning, collecting ferns. And so Margaret Gatty published this book that's still being used called I think it's called the Manual of Seaweed or whatever. And her illustrations are fantastic, and they're online. If you just look up Margaret Gatty, you can see her beautiful seaweed drawings. So, well,
and the same thing happened in ornithology, and I think in probably other sciences as well, because the women often had these more complicated lives where they were juggling domesticity and science, or, you know, supporting the family and these greater challenges. They certainly, Louise was part of a large North American network of women self-trained mostly, some university trained ornithologists, and they would send their studies to each other for critique, and they would, Louise was out in the woods, like there was no library, there was nothing, there was no university, nothing nearby, and these other women would ship her boxes of books to read and to help her in her researches. So it was, that's one of the things that I found really, really interesting were these networks. And it was a smaller world then. I don't know if Bob Montgomery is in the audience there, but he was my scientific reader, and he wrote 10,000 Birds, Ornithology Since Darwin. And in there he says that in the last couple of decades, there have been, forgive me if I get this stat wrong, there have been as many papers published as between now and Darwin's time. So nobody can keep up on all of it now. I mean, there's almost no point in sharing, right? And it's all digitized anyway. But I think that personal interaction was really important.
Mm-hmm. I think so too.
Okay, we're just past 7, so maybe I'll just ask one more question and then we can wrap it up. Okay. So this is for you, Merilyn. A lifelong birder yourself, did you learn anything new about birds or any species from Louise? Something you did not know before?
Yeah, I did. The Canada jay is, the whiskey jack, the camp robber, he's got a lot of common names because the Canada jay is really gregarious, seemingly, and it's now Canada's official national bird. But to reproduce, it goes deep into wilderness boreal forest, and it reproduces in March in Northern Ontario. So that, a lot of questions around that. And when Louise came along, nobody had ever witnessed the life cycle, the reproductive cycle of the Canada jay. But she found a nest and watched it and found that two birds, the two parent birds, were sitting stacked on the nest like a duvet, like a double duvet. And that's how they kept the eggs warm to incubate them in such cold weather. And what they have discovered since, so when she told Margaret Nice this, she said, well, okay, but what do they eat? What do they feed the babies? And researchers have found since that Canada jays are hoarders, right? They snatch food and then they hide it under the scales, the bark of black spruce trees, specifically black spruce trees. And then when the chicks hatch, they feed this food to the chicks, and it's preserved because the black spruce resin acts as a preservative. So So studies that she did inevitably led me forward to other studies. And yeah, I feel that definitely my, like you, Helen, my understanding and my appreciation for birds that I kind of took for granted before has really changed. So.
Oh, I guess we've come to the end. I think that's it.
There are other questions, and maybe we can we might be able to type an answer in or something later, maybe not. Anyway, I wish we could see all your faces.
But thanks for coming and listening to us.
Yes.
And, yeah.
And thank you all for helping me launch my book. I do want to mention the video that was made called Woman Watching. I don't know if you've had a chance to see it yet, Helen, but my granddaughter, who's a filmmaker, and my son, her uncle, who's a sound designer, worked on this film, which I wrote and narrated, and recorded the narration in a cleaning closet in Mexico, which I renovated to create a sound studio, which was pretty fun. And it's really lovely. If you go to my website, MerilynSimons.com, and click on the book, you'll see a link to that video. And I think it really catches the spirit of Louise, and it has Louise's voice in it. We use some of her actual voice recordings when it's really nice to hear her voice. Yeah.
Great. Good.
Okay. Well,
All right.
thanks everybody.
Thank you. Thanks. Thanks, Merilyn.
Bye.
Bye.